Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's first panel. I apologize for looking a bit as though I ran here in a suit in the hot sun, which I did, so in order to get here, so that's why. So today we're going to talk about political economy across the whole region of the Indo-Pacific from a variety of different perspectives, and we've got four really good experts to help us do that. First up, we have Christy Govella of Oxford University.
Great, thank you. And thanks, first of all, to the organizers for having me. It's been a very stimulating day of discussions already. So I work basically at the intersection of economics and security, and a lot of my work does deal with straight trade and investment, but I think I wanted to talk a little bit about particularly the interconnections between political economy and some of these other issue areas like security to start out, and maybe serve as a bridge from our discussions yesterday. So essentially, the main point I want to make in my remarks, or my bottom line up front, so to speak, is that I really think political economy is at the center of the discussions that are happening across the Indo-Pacific right now. But the interpretations, the different interpretations of political economic interests and the complex ways that they're connected with security and other issues really complicate these discussions and our predictions of the future. So logically, there's been an intense focus on the US government policy recently, but actually much will depend on the actions of other governments and non-state actors like companies in the future. So I'll touch on all those points. So the first point is a rather basic one that I want to make, but it really is striking that in foreign policy circles across the Indo-Pacific, in Europe, and the US now, political economic issues are actually seen as driving foreign policy and international relations, even by people who are traditionally defense experts. This is really different than 10 years ago, for example, when I went to work for a US Department of Defense educational institution, and my essential job was to explain to security practitioners why they should care about trade. And I would tell them, this is the era of TPP is as important to the US as another aircraft carrier, for example, and we would talk about that. But now that's not a conversation you have. People, they may not understand the complexities of political economy, but they understand that this is something that they need to be aware of, that poses constraints for their policy, that in some cases they might need to use as a tool of deterrence, for example. So it's a very different conversation today. And right now, I think the issue that everyone is grappling with is economic nationalism and how that's driving national security. The second point that I want to make is that the interpretation of economic interests is a key issue. And although we've been talking a lot about the drastic changes in the second Trump administration's policy, which are very drastic in some ways, there are strong elements of continuity with the previous Biden administration that came before. And I think this really reflects a lot of the tensions that we see in how all governments are thinking about these economic issues. So for example, I would say the key difference with the previous administration's policy was that they still had these economic nationalist trends, but there was also an idea that like-minded allies and partners could work together on issues for security reasons. And you had this strong discussion of economic security that essentially replaced US trade policy in an era where market access was no longer an option. So we saw, for example, the Biden administration talking about foreign policy for the middle class, a strong focus on job creation. He didn't remove the tariffs on China. He blocked the Nippon Steel deal. So all of these things reflected those basic political economic calculations. But at the same time, there was a discussion, there was this possibility for win-win policies. We could do reshoring and friendshoring or ally shoring, et cetera. So in some of my work, I've looked at this kind of economic security cooperation between the US and countries like Japan and South Korea. And I think that it's really essential to just remind ourselves that there's no consensus about what economic security would look like. There's no consensus really about what trade policy should look like right now. So instead, what I think, if we look at economic security, is that we see governments pursuing distinct combinations of three different goals. One is resilience, so basically reducing risks from disruptions. The second is competitiveness, which is promoting domestic economic capabilities, and this is where we see a lot of the industrial policy return that we've had recently. And then the third is protection, or you could just say protectionism, which is restricting or disadvantaging foreign competition. So in my research, for example, I've looked at the US, Japan, and South Korea, and I see really different mixes of different policies like industrial policy, tariffs, export controls, inward and outward investment screening, supply chain policies. So even during the Biden administration, although the talk was of a different tone, there were these tensions, and not all of these goals could be achieved in the same balance. And the US was always heavier on the punitive side of export controls and strategic tariffs than the others. So essentially what we've seen is that the US has gone even more heavily into that direction now. But to kind of echo the opening comments, I think that if you reflect upon these tensions, it's pretty strongly suggests that we'll see elements of continuity in, for example, US trade policy in another administration, even if it's a Democratic administration. So understanding those continuities and forces and interactions is important. The third point is on this issue of interpretation. We've heard the same kinds of statements that economic security is national security many times, but I think that the question we're trying to grapple with is how these logics will interact to shape policy. And I would echo, again, the opening comments that there are certain structural features that do matter, and I think will bring different countries back to different parts of the conversation. So if we're thinking about political economy, I think we will see a return of discussions about different kinds of cooperation in strategic areas. In the last administration, for example, we saw all of these dialogues on critical and emerging technologies, semiconductors, dual-use technologies like space that have civilian and military applications, a lot of talk about defense industrial base co-development, these things. We saw cooperation in third markets on things like Open RAN development to create more robust telecommunications infrastructure. Undersea cables, that was an area where the US, Australia, and Japan worked together to try to fund some initiatives in the Pacific Islands, for example. So a lot of these things are now in limbo because we don't really know what the status is, and the US is tilted towards this policy again of a focus on protection, and they would like to be instead more self-sufficient or just have all of the investment if possible. But the realities again of political economy is that that kind of self-sufficiency isn't really possible for many of these issues, and so those structural concerns, both about security and the structural realities, I think, of economic cooperation and technologies will pull people back. And we already hear, even in this administration, vetting of ideas for cooperation on shipbuilding, which would again involve Japan and South Korea and the US, energy, et cetera. So I think there is a lot of capacity for these different things to interact and change. Briefly, a fourth point, bringing other actors into it, is that I think we really need to consider what we think is going to shape the new architecture of cooperation as we move forward. And I think a lot of this, although again there is a focus on the US, really depends on what other governments and countries do. And so there is a lot of agency in this situation. There is room for creativity. Recently, I think there's been a proliferation of ideas about scenarios about the world, where we might end up in 5 or 10 or 20 years. If we focus on political economy and trade, we all know that the international trade system is in crisis, that institutions, even if you want them to succeed, they need significant reform. There needs to be a revitalization of discussions. But it's very unclear what the ideas are for that future and what kind of interactions we want to be structured. So will it be global, regional, minilateral, sectoral, unilateral, et cetera? I think all of those questions are still up for grabs. But there are opportunities there, and I think it's not just the US, it's about what others do and how they shape those orders across various issue areas. And then a final point, thinking about non-state actors who've come up occasionally in the last day, but I think in political economy, the role of firms, the roles of companies, is essential, and I think that there's a lot of assumptions being made sometimes about the way that government policy is going to influence companies and the way that this is going to actually change on-the-ground realities of markets. But it's not an automatic process. This is a process where, indeed, private actors have agency. They will react in the short term and long term in different ways that will complicate these decisions. But we are seeing a change in dynamic where companies had been relatively free to focus on economic incentives and to structure their operations in complex supply chains with very little buffers for risk, for example. And then again, the main difference that we're seeing is a shift away from these positive incentives to get companies to voluntarily reshore, like subsidies or loans or all these kinds of things, to a more punitive approach where now they'll be tariffed or they'll be penalized. And so that is a change in dynamics. And in the short term, this means that many firms have been, for example, forced to rely on their home governments to negotiate with the US to get rid of tariffs. They're a little bit more powerless than they are usually. And they're thinking about what to do, but again, the short term versus the long term could look very different. And so I think there is a lot of contingency and agency and different interacting logics. So the more that we can bridge the conversations between political economy and security in a way that I think most people realize is necessary, I think will help us to have more sustainable and realistic solutions for the future. So I'll end there.
Great, thank you very much. Lots and lots of things to discuss when we come back in the discussion and question and answer period. Next up we have Soo-Yeon Kim of the University of British Columbia.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you especially for coming out on a Saturday morning for this panel. I have in my notes here that I should start with something cheerful because the reality is not so, a little bit more sobering. You probably have noticed trade has never been more important in the public eye. So, I remember just before the pandemic, I remember going to a panel and hearing one of my colleagues get up and say, in the National Election Survey, there's a question. In the American National Election Survey, there's a question. What do you think is the most important issue facing the nation? And she asked, how many times do you think trade makes it to the top 10? And the answer was never. Never. In her analysis, never. Right? So things must look pretty different in the last few months. I could also say from the ground up, it's been wonderful. I've had conversations about tariffs with Uber drivers, right? Or in grocery stores where we see in Canada, many, many, many banners saying "Buy Canadian," right? So in many respects, it's been for trade warriors or trade scholars. It's been a great boon. Let's just say we're beneficiaries of that. The reality is a bit more sobering. So I'm going to make a couple of claims, some observations, and I really have only one message, but sort of lead up to this. The first thing is, to Rolf Emmer's point, who said this yesterday already, the U.S., right? The U.S. is, I wouldn't say abdicated, I would say reneged, right? Goes so far, and definitely retreated from its commitment to multilateralism, right? To the multilateral trading order as we know it. And so this is something also, and to Christie's point, there has been a continuation. So Trump 1.0, we see the start of the U.S.-China trade war. But Biden very much continued the tariffs. Right? And he also took a much more softer approach, but the IRA, the CHIPS Act, all served to prioritize domestic manufacturing. Reflects a long-term shift. Trump 2.0, you expand the war. It's U.S. against everybody, right? And Liberation Day. But what we should remember is that there is bipartisan support in the United States for a global tariff, just not at the levels that President Trump was advocating. All right, so what to remember that there is this change in, perhaps we can say a seismic change in where that originates in the United States and its commitment to this multilateral trading order as we know it. And so the second observation is that as a response, firms, countries, the strategy appears to be, and as rightly should be, is a long-term strategy. Right? They're realizing this is not a short-term, instability, right? It's not a sort of just a little break or something. It's not this. We're here for the long haul. So this seismic shift is the new normal, right? And firms and countries need to strategize for the long term in terms of restructuring production globally in all sorts of ways. So we need to have a long-term view about the changes, about what we need to change in terms of our own engagement in the global economy. And the result of these two things, I think, has brought about unprecedented levels of uncertainty, right? And this is no vanilla uncertainty. This is uncertainty about the state of the world. It's uncertainty about the future, uncertainty about really the institutional bargain, right, that is at the center of the post-World War II, right, international order and the institutional architecture. All right, so having said this, right, we have questions like, who is committed to multilateralism still, right? I think I claimed once it's the world is watching. So we had a similar Indo-Pacific panel at the University of British Columbia. Right, what now is the world is watching. Everybody's watching everybody else. Are you going to stay committed to multilateralism, or are you going to retreat yourself? All right. So in this era, right? Oh, sorry. The other question, very important, is the question of leadership. Right. So those of us trained international relations, we have both the contending views, right? Strong correlation between the existence of the hegemon, the one large economy, and an open trading order. When that hegemon declines or retreats, we see a reversion to protectionism, a closed trading order, right? Will that come to bear fruit here? On the other side, oh no, but if you set up the right institutions, the institutions have more enduring, right? An ability to continue to, in some ways, maintain the order, even if there is no hegemon. So we're going to see, basically, which hypothesis I think is really going to be, supported in the, I think, even in the short term. All right. So having said that, so the one message I want to sort of put out there for you for discussion is that it's going to be transparency that's going to be the key moving forward. So transparency, like everything needs to be visible, and I'm saying this not just because I study trade agreements, but trade agreements are going to be really important in this. There was a time when we debated whether trade agreements were building blocks or stumbling blocks to multilateralism. But in the wake of President Trump's tariffs, it was, my first reaction was, wow, isn't it great we have all these agreements in place, right? That help to sort of lock in, make transparent our commitment, right? If we violate them, that's going to be transparent. Right? So they're increasing. So these are really important mechanisms of transparency, I would argue. Right? And looking to the Indo-Pacific, right, it is so interesting. We have two of the largest trade agreements in existence today. The CPTPP, in case you didn't know what that stood for, it's the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. The other is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, the RCEP. So these are two of the largest agreements. They're all in Asia. And notably, neither of them, right, the U.S. is signatory to neither of them, not participant in any of these. So in some ways, in the Indo-Pacific, we already see a certain kind of institutional architecture that has been in progress without the participation of the United States. Right? Something to look for on the horizon, and I think it is very much on the agenda of the APEC meeting that will be held in Korea later this year, is this free trade area of the Asia-Pacific. Right? Given the existence of the RCEP and the CPTPP, would be a 27-member trade agreement, very, very large. Apparently it is quite. I hear from the ground that the Korean government, they're the president. I guess they're chair of APEC this year. They're going to really prioritize this in the discussions in the meeting. So it's something to take note of and to pay attention to. So. Anyway, the other area where Asia is very much a leader in a frontier in economic governance, of course, is the digital economy, governance of the digital economy. The Digital Economic Agreement that was signed, and it's a very interesting set of countries like Singapore, Chile, New Zealand, right? It's the first of its kind, right? Open to accession, but we can see many more initiatives of this kind that are taking place in the absence of the United States and participation. So something very much to look forward to. I will end on a less cheerful note, and it's something that I haven't actually come to figure out. Is there a solution to this, right? Because there seems to be no solution, but there's wide agreement, right? The big hurdle, right, to getting all this, right, to be successful, is that there really is no substitute for the American consumer market. It seems I'm American. We Americans spend a lot. We like to spend a lot, right? And apparently it would be very, very difficult, right, to kind of have the kind of market, right, available to somehow, if we were to all divert our trade somewhere, there is no comparable market out there that's comparable to the United States. Anyway, but still, I hope you get the message. Transparency as the key, right, to navigating this era of uncertainty and how important trade agreements are in terms of supporting this transparency. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you. Thanks very much also for some very stimulating remarks that we can come back to as well in the question time. Up third, we have Doug Fuller of the Copenhagen Business School.
So thanks to the organizers and to Bill for hosting this. I'm going to take a very different tack, I think, than my colleagues. I'm very happy we have two people talking about trade agreements, because I'm going to argue something else. These trade agreements don't really matter. They're epiphenomenon, because our international finance and trade system is fundamentally broken and has been for a long time. You can date it maybe from the end of Bretton Woods, probably more from the 1990s. And channeling Cambridge's own Joan Robinson, why is it broken? Well, it's broken because she would call it bigger than neighbor policies, but certain countries have decided to structure their economies so they're running current account surpluses. The global trade balance has to balance, so other countries have to run trade deficits. Guess who runs these trade deficits? It's the open economies that are willing to have fully floating exchange rates. Number one, of course, is the United States. There's the extra wrinkle that the US dollar is the prime reserve currency. But I think in the debates about how much that matters, it only partially matters. Because if you look at other open economies, Canada, Australia, the UK, you see a similar phenomenon. These countries are running persistent current account deficits. So what does this have to do with the Indo-Pacific? Well, a large number of the countries that are running these current account surpluses come from the Indo-Pacific region, principally East Asia and Southeast Asia. And it's varied over time. Japan has for a very long time, also Taiwan has been a persistent surplus country. In more recent times, over the last 10 plus years, South Korea has joined this group, as have a number of Southeast Asian countries. I'm going to sneak in some European cases, if I may, even though this is about the Indo-Pacific, to show I'm not just picking on Indo-Pacific countries. There are also very aggressive, I think we should call these neo-mercantilist countries elsewhere in the world. Denmark is running very high and persistent since the early 1990s current account surpluses. The Danish kroner is simply underpriced. They would say, well, in our constitution, we have it fixed against the euro, so we couldn't possibly change it. My response is, if you had fixed it the wrong way, so that you were running current account deficits, I'm pretty sure you would have already changed your constitution. Then there's Sweden, who you can just look about their currency intervention. They've accumulated large foreign exchange reserves, suggesting that there's a willpower behind the undervalued Swedish kroner. Similarly, the Swiss franc, also for a long time very undervalued. The Eurozone is a very strange case because you have various national economies that shouldn't be in a currency zone together. Some are in perpetual deficit, others in surplus. I'll just say that the outcome from the global financial crisis was to take the Eurozone from basically imbalanced, it would flip up and down around zero in terms of the current account, to also having persistent surpluses based essentially on imposed austerity on Southern Europe. Now my second point would be, why does this matter? Why should we care? Going back to some earlier points about protectionism, well, one simple reason is you can't really just take tariff rates and judge protectionism that way. If the European Union and Japan have a free trade agreement and zero tariffs on autos, which they do, but the Japanese yen is 40% undervalued against the euro, at least for the Eurozone portion of the European Union. Essentially, you're facing a 40% tariff of your goods into Japan and Japanese being subsidized at 40% into your country, into your trade region. And what we see actually with these persistent deficit countries is they tend to have lower manufacturing as a share of GDP than they would otherwise have. Just to cut off the people who are going to say, oh, we can't go back to the 1950s when 1 out of every 3 workers was employed in manufacturing. I agree. Notice I said share of GDP. I didn't say share of the workforce. But of course, the larger share of GDP, presumably you're going to have slightly more workers in that sector as well. And also more to the point, even in countries that were never very industrialized, like Denmark, you see very high labor participation rates, and in the deficit countries, much lower ones. If you just look at the OECD countries and the big surplus countries versus the big deficit countries, there's a significant gap between the two. The one exception is Korea, actually, but then you take into account gender, frankly. Like Korean men, very high labor force participation. Korean women, abysmal labor force participation. That sort of accounts for that particular case. So there are real reasons to be concerned about having these persistent deficits. And the third point is, well, what would be a healthier system? What would a healthy system look like? Well, that would be one where most of the major economies would be sort of like the Eurozone from its founding until 2011. You're never running large trade surpluses or deficits. They kind of are just reacting to interest rate gaps tending around zero. The countries that are gaining competitiveness would briefly run surpluses. Their economy would heat up. Money would pour in on the capital account side, and there would be this natural adjustment. What we have now is we don't have this adjustment side. Even as certain economies gain in their competitiveness, they're not allowing their exchange rates to adjust accordingly. And on top of that, the one type of country that should have current account deficits, which means you're importing capital, arguably are those countries that have good growth prospects, but they're still relatively poor countries, right? They arguably do not have enough capital domestically. So think Korea in the 1960s and 70s, where they were just doing that. And arguably in recent decades, India is a similar case. So that's also a healthy model for certain developing countries. You actually could fruitfully use more capital than you have domestically, so you'd be running current account deficits. Instead, we have the strange system where we have quite capital-rich countries, some of them, running these current account deficits, meaning they're importing capital that it's very unlikely they need. If you just look at the US, for example, corporate profits are very high, could fully account for all the investment needs of the US. So why is all this foreign money pouring in? Well, it's pouring in because places like Taiwan want to make sure that new Taiwanese dollar stays low, so they're buying US assets. And finally, going back to sort of the geopolitics of this and concerns about whether it's supply chain resiliency or overall productive capacity, if you need to fight a war or supply a war somewhere else, like in the Ukraine, there are serious concerns if you're on the persistent deficit side, current account deficit, that you've really kind of are undermining your industrial base. It's wonderful for the US to cooperate with Japan and South Korea, but let's face the facts that in an event of a kinetic war in East Asia, we might not have access, if you're thinking from a US perspective or a European perspective, to that industrial capacity of formal or semi-formal allies in East Asia. So you probably would want to build up that capacity closer to home. And then the fourth point, what is to be done about this? Not to channel Vladimir Ilyich, but well, what's interesting about the US government is they're not really doing any coherent policy to address these changes. They're slapping around a lot of different tariffs, but arguably that doesn't really make any sense. Australia, Canada, the UK, these aren't the countries running persistent current account surpluses, so why is the US trying to fight a trade war with them? People like Michael Pettis recently in the Council in Foreign Affairs suggested, well, you want to have protection, but against these current account surplus countries, and gather in the other countries that are sort of current account neutral or in deficit within this block of countries. So that would be quite a different policy than Donald Trump is currently pursuing. Now, another option would be to have some sort of negotiated settlement. People have joked about a Mar-a-Lago Accord. It doesn't seem like there's much seriousness within the Trump administration to try to think of some negotiated settlement to this. And the other wrinkle here is you have to have some teeth to this agreement, so the current account surplus countries can't just revert to what they were already doing. And it's important to go back and look at the Plaza Accords, because there was a brief period of appreciation, a lot of these currencies, but the ones that were really quite interested for their domestic political reasons to run these current account surpluses quickly reverted back to intervening in currency markets and having relative depreciation set in quite quickly, actually. So a one-off appreciation won't really work. Finally, there's the issue of timing. Is the world going to world order collapse tomorrow, as no one has faith that the US, Canada, the UK, Australia, and other such countries can continue, France, can continue importing beyond their means? Not necessarily, but like all bankruptcies, it happens slowly until it happens all at once. And certainly you could say some of Donald Trump's moves are sort of accelerationist, probably unintentionally, undermining any faith in the US dollar. So it would probably be better, we would be better off to confront this head on and come up with a sustainable solution. Institutions were talked about before. We need these new institutions that were failed to be put in the Bretton Woods system, failed to be built after Bretton Woods, and still need to be built. Finally, do I have any time left? No. All right. I will not make my last point about, just say it's going to be more difficult for some countries to adjust to this system than others. I would say for countries like China and Taiwan, adjusting to a current account neutral growth model would be quite difficult.
Okay, thank you very much. And finally, we have Pasha Sia of Singapore Management University.
Well, thank you very much, Bill, for your kind invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. Before entering academia, I worked as a legal officer at the WTO Secretariat in Geneva and as a lawyer at an international law firm in Washington, D.C. As I'm now based in Singapore, I will offer ASEAN perspective on Indo-Pacific agreements. After the Cold War, Asian regionalism became feasible primarily because of the hegemonic stability that the United States provided for the region. Hegemonic stability refers to the essential role of a dominant power as a stabilizer. It underpins the rules-based development of international law and international trade. And as we know, the global economic architecture is confronting unprecedented challenges. In particular, Trump 2.0 has converted U.S. leadership from hegemonic stability to what I call hegemonic instability. Many unilateral Make America Great Again policies contravene the objective of international organizations, particularly the WTO. Southeast Asia, or ASEAN, now stands at the crossroads of the US-China rivalry. On the one hand, China is ASEAN's top trading partner. On the other hand, America is ASEAN's largest investor and export market. I think and several ASEAN countries have benefited from cooperation's China Plus One or de-risking strategy by moving manufacturing plants out of China. But the strategy faces a dilemma now because of Trump's reciprocal tariff, which are expected to impose more than 30% tariffs on selected ASEAN countries, including Indonesia, Thailand, and Vietnam. And also notably, the United States Court of International Trade just struck down Trump's tariffs plan on the ground that they exceeded presidential authority under IEEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. So we actually don't know what will happen. So let me switch the focus back to ASEAN, as well as its impact on the Indo-Pacific political economy. ASEAN is set to become the world's fourth largest economy by 2030. ASEAN Center Framework have already forged the normative integration process for what I call New Asian regionalism. Facing geopolitical stability, ASEAN leaders are aware that the bloc needs to ensure resilience against non-traditional security threats, ranging from weaponized trade to climate change. Many colleagues yesterday mentioned the recent ASEAN summit in Kuala Lumpur. ASEAN leaders also adopted the new ASEAN Community Vision 2045 and reiterated that ASEAN's goal is to become the epicenter of growth in the Indo-Pacific region. This is in line with ASEAN's Indo-Pacific strategy, which is outlined in the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific. The AOIP emphasizes that the ASEAN centrality is to maintain its central role in the evolving regional architecture. As ASEAN will soon increase to 11 members, including Timor-Leste, the bloc's continued relevance depends on actively fortifying the concept of ASEAN centrality through existing internal and external agreements and mechanisms. ASEAN's economic framework includes three important pillars. One, AEC, ASEAN Economic Community. Second, multiple ASEAN plus one FTA. And third, as Suyo mentioned, the RCEP. The RCEP is the world's largest FTA by economic scale, accounting for 30% of global GDP. So let me address the three important pillars one by one. First, what is AEC? ASEAN's supply chain resilience first and foremost relies upon its own integration as a single market. The ASEAN Economic Community's most notable success is creating an almost tariff-free regime. When I say almost, because it's not 100%, but it's more than 99%. However, non-tariff barriers have steadily grown to more than 6,000 measures, ranging from sanitary requirement to technical standards. The existing soft law approach has not meaningfully remedied the problem. Douglas mentioned dispute settlement. Let me address that. ASEAN states concluded the protocol on EDSM enhanced dispute settlement mechanism in 2004 to deal with state disputes. The EDSM simply copied and pasted the WTO dispute settlement with some minor institutional differences. Guess how many countries have used the system? Zero. True, because most ASEAN countries will much prefer to use the WTO dispute settlement mechanism. I would argue that with the paralyzed WTO appellate body, where I worked before, contributing to the problem of appealing into the void, the regional mechanism can actually provide an ideal alternative, which can be more effective and less costly. Second, what are ASEAN plus one FTAs? So they're referring to ASEAN's FTA with regional economies, including China, India, Australia. ASEAN centrality is embedded in the AEC's global ASEAN agenda, which aim to keep those ASEAN plus one FTA fit for purpose for the 21st century. Last month, the upgraded trilateral FTA, ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand FTA came into force. The negotiations of the ASEAN-China FTA 3.0 upgrade and the new ASEAN-Canada FTA will also conclude this year. And the development of those ASEAN plus one FTAs are not just important to FTA, but all the regional trade agreements, because they elevated the benchmark for modern trade deals. Finally, let me address the RCEP that Suyo mentioned. RCEP includes 15 parties. It's not led by China, as many Western commentators claim. All ASEAN parties, including China, agree that RCEP is an ASEAN-led process. Compared to the CPTPP, the RCEP is often portrayed as a low-level agreement. My view is that this proposition ignores the reality that the RCEP is only used as a framework that converges consensus, therefore leaving many controversial issues for future implementation and negotiation. For instance, the transition from positive list to more ambitious negative list scheduling of services commitments, as well as the development of ISDS, investor-state dispute settlement rules, need to be closely monitored. Institutionally, the RCEP support unit was created within the ASEAN Secretariat last year. Well, this unit should be incrementally expanded to become an independent RCEP Secretariat. And given the slow progress of the WTO negotiations, the expansion of the CPTPP and the RCEP is actually critical. The United Kingdom became the 12th CPTPP member last year. The UK accession to the CPTPP expands its share of global GDP to 15%. Several countries have submitted formal requests to join the CPTPP. Last year, the CPTPP Commission launched the accession process for Costa Rica. The current challenge is to deal with applications from both China and Taiwan. Although the CPTPP accession is open to states and separate custom territory, the process itself is based on consensus, so is inevitably political. Indonesia is the most recent country that requested to join the CPTPP. Not just the CPTPP, Indonesia also joined BRICS and is also in the process of joining the OECD. And for the RCEP, the most likely new member will be Hong Kong, which has Beijing's support and has already concluded trade and investment agreement with ASEAN. So what should we do for ASEAN? Well, the ASEAN's ongoing coordination and dialogue with the CPTPP and the RCEP, as well as the EU and the GCC, Gulf Cooperation Council, will amplify ASEAN's centrality in a multipolar order for sure. And going forward, the most cutting-edge issues are digital trade and sustainability. ASEAN is now negotiating a digital economic framework agreement, which is different from the digital agreement that Suyo mentioned. I think ASEAN should also expedite what I call green regionalism. The EU and the US have always focused on enforcement approach, which seek to make sustainability rules under FTA subject to dispute settlement. I think ASEAN should go for market-driven mechanisms instead. Innovative examples include agreements such as the New Zealand-led ACCTS, Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability, and the Australia-New Zealand Green Economy Agreement. These sectoral agreements, so they are not FTA, they only focus on one issue. Sectoral agreements focus on liberalizing environmental goods and services, reforming fossil fuel subsidies, and promoting eco-labeling. The consolidation of these agreements with new digital and sustainability rules will transform ASEAN into a new normative power in the Indo-Pacific political economy. So let me conclude this. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Thank you all four for amazing remarks. If I were to try to sum up sort of each of the things that was stressed most strongly by the speakers, I would say basically we've got competition, transparency, current accounts, and regionalism, sort of in that order. Now, what that makes me think on a certain level is, 41 years ago, I think it was, or 42 years ago, a book was published called Commerce and Coalitions by Ronald Rogowski. And in this whole book is a sort of radical reinterpretation for the time of economic history of the world through the lens of something called the Stolper-Samuelson hypothesis or theorem. And what that really added up to So the main thrust of the argument is that countries' economic and trade and political positions in the world were largely driven by the constellation of factors of production with which they were endowed. So land, labor, and capital. And in certain climates of expanding trade and loosening restrictions, abundant factors would benefit and therefore take on stronger political roles inside their countries. And in other situations of constricted trade or more trade barriers, declining global economy, scarce factors would have a stronger role in politically inside each country. Now, could it not be that what we're actually seeing, so two points. First is, could it not be that what we're actually seeing is the world dividing into sort of three parts, where we have primary products exporters who are really dependent still on land or on resources extracted from the land in one form or another, whether they be mining resources, agricultural resources, or something else. Labor-rich manufacturing economies, where labor is benefiting quite a bit from employment, and exports of industrial goods are kind of the order of the day. And then capital-rich service economies that run current account deficits but capital account surpluses, and essentially control the global financial system and benefit from all of this sort of inbound investment. And so the upshot of that is that, first of all, some of this could be structurally determined, what we're seeing in terms of the division of world trade, but also that there are advantages as well as disadvantages to being in each of those structural positions within the system that I think perhaps we occlude when we focus excessively only on trade deficits and tariffs and things like this. In other words, it may be quite beneficial to run a large current account deficit with a large capital account surplus, if properly managed in terms of domestic policy, although that will never be good for labor. Right? It'll be very good for capital, it would not be good for labor. So the second point then, the second question is, whatever we think of the first question, on the second question, almost all of you alluded in some way to the European Union as this kind of unwieldy regional bloc that promotes an integrated economy of national economies that really shouldn't be integrated naturally. Right? That these national level economies are so different in terms of their trade policy, their various deficits, surpluses, and so on. If, and this I think is a huge if, ASEAN or some similar grouping, whether that be CPTPP or RCEP or any of these things, if this is actually moving in the direction of constructing some kind of meaningful grouping or bloc, perhaps not quite equivalent to the European Union, is it not also at the same, or I would say even greater risk of this kind of internal inconsistency or incoherence? And therefore either not working or working too well to the detriment actually of the member states. So with that, let me open up the floor as well before we give the panelists a chance, because we are running low on time. So this time let's start with this side of the room and anyone with questions. Yes.
Good morning. Chris Holtby from the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office. I'm actually here as a spokesman for the French, which makes me slightly uncomfortable, but internationalist. Really interesting to hear Macron yesterday in Shangri-La talk about CPTPP alignment with the EU. Speaks to your point just now, Bill. What do the panel think about the possibilities of making that work in a meaningful way?
Let's take a few more in a bank, if we could. Collect a current account surplus of questions. And start from the back, let's say, on the side.
So one specific question and one for the entire panel. So you talked about capital controls and convertibility of currencies. Do we kind of just take it as a given that the US is unlikely to tackle its national debt, and what kind of impact does that have? And a wider question, Bill summed up about competition, transparency, financial mechanisms. I didn't hear anything about cooperation. Has cooperation had its day, or is there a place for that in the international political economy?
Thanks. In some ways, this picks up on Bill's invocation of Rogowski, but I'm also thinking of the panel yesterday at the other building on the sort of the domestic and the international and how those align. And it's intriguing that they're amidst this salad bowl, spaghetti bowl, whatever thing one wants to use for all the different trade agreements and so forth. There's an assumption that these will have both distinct impact and impact overall. And yet, at the same time, we could see, particularly since so many of the economies involved are more competitive than cooperative in some ways, just in terms of their specific comparative advantage, their market niche, their goals, and so forth. But also the rise of, for instance, resource nationalism in Indonesia, or particular forms of labor disputes. That actually could be more of a question for Bill than for the panel. In some of these states, I'm wondering about the domestic politics of all of this. Like, how sustainable is it to think about an ASEAN bloc where you have garment workers in Cambodia who have been working for firms that will not have, this gets to Suyan's point about the missing American market, will not have a market for their goods. There's an assumption that these states will pay for trade adjustment and those sorts of things, which is probably not the case. But then that citizens would be willing to accept that reskilling or downskilling or whatever it may be, and the adjustments that are being asked of them in the name of shifting patterns of trade and cooperation. So really, at what point does this become a domestic political crisis in some of these states? In what sequence? I know you probably can't predict that with surety, but I'm curious about how that becomes part of the mix.
Great. We'll take three more kind of diagonally, starting from the side over there and then to Ben and Scott.
Thank you very much. I have a question for Professor Grovella. It's specifically about, I wonder if you could go into a bit more detail about industrial policy and how you see that playing out more recently, because it seems to me, on my sort of cursory understanding of the literature, that on the literature that focused on the East Asian erstwhile developmental states, there was a kind of consensus that in the 1990s there was a retreat of the state and a transition towards neoliberalism. But at the same time, in the literature that dealt more broadly internationally, there seemed to be this understanding actually that states were more engaged in sort of industrial policy and economic statecraft. I don't know if that's a correct reading of the literature, but that's the impression I receive. But particularly, I'm also interested in the United States, because it seems that under Biden there were efforts to have certain kinds of industrial policies under the IRA and things like that. But I mean, can we see that under Trump? It seems to me that in Trump there's an understanding that you just raise tariffs and somehow magically you sort of get the development of, regain America's former industrial prowess and things like that. So yeah, just a basic question. I wonder if you could talk a bit more about how industrial policy is, how you see it as having played out in these respective regions.
Thanks. Ben Bland from Chatham House. Dr. Kim, you rightly mentioned that there's no alternative in the world to the US as a source of final demand, but it's also the same is true of China as a source of production. There is no alternative to China as a source of global manufacturing, and prosperity in the last few decades has basically been underpinned by this US-China production consumption nexus. So if that's being broken down, how much do you think we're just facing an era of much reduced prosperity for the whole world, regardless of all these trade agreements or cooperation agreements, because of the pure economic fundamentals? Thanks.
Great. And now for the last question of this round, to Scott.
Thanks very much. Actually, quite similar question, picking up from a comment that Doug in particular made about China having a very difficult time dealing with any kind of current account neutral type situation. And I'd like to sort of turn that into the broader question of China's domestic political economy challenges, which I think are very substantial, and frankly, we haven't talked much about at all, at least in the panels in this room. I wasn't able to attend those at FAMES, but I'd be interested in the panel's views on the extent of those challenges and how they affect the region as a whole.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for some really interesting questions. Let's allow the panelists to respond in the same order, if possible, that they spoke originally.
Great. Well, thanks for those questions. I'll try to hit a number of points that I think addresses multiple questions. So first, I think there have been a few questions that kind of touch on this question of domestic politics. You know, how is trade going to impact these countries? What about the political sustainability or practical consequences? And I mean, to be clear, I think that's the fundamental problem of what led us here today, right? That the realities of the ideas about how trade was going to work, it didn't sit well with domestic populations who feel that they were not served well and that the benefits from trade did not, in fact, trickle down equally to folks. And that's why you're getting this pushback against the system, right? So I think the question, the big hard question for folks thinking about what comes next is how do you embed, you know, greater openness of markets in social systems that actually work? Like, what does actual trade adjustment look like? And that's a very difficult, very political question that varies across countries. But that is why we are seeing, not just in the US, in many European countries and many Asian countries all around the world, push back against this. And clearly we can't go back into exactly the same direction that we came from. So, you know, we could think about specific scenarios, but if we do that again, it is not going to work. The question about CPTPP alignment is very interesting. If people who follow trade remember that there was once a parallel, when CPTPP was only the Trans-Pacific Partnership, there was also the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, that was a partner agreement in the era of US mega trade deals between the US and Europe. So I think there is a lot of compatibility, a lot of possibility. The negotiations would be complicated. There would be a lot of things. But, you know, I think that if you believe in kind of this building up approach, it would be one way to go. So don't reform the WTO from the top down, because we're at loggerheads perhaps, although perhaps you probably still need to do that. But you could also go this route of trying to shore up those deals, and that would be one way to do it. Very, it makes sense in a lot of ways, but it would be complicated. What about cooperation? It's such an important question. I mean, to be clear again, I think that there is a lot of cooperation going on. Like, trade is still continuing, companies are still doing business. There's a lot of uncertainty, but there is also a lot of cooperation happening. And like I said, even in situations where we are in economic nationalism, I think there's space for cooperation. And the hard part is that the interests don't read automatically onto policies, right? It's all about how you want to interpret what your interests are and what room there is or what necessity there is for cooperation. So I think that you know, going back to total autarky is not really, again, an option for most countries due to either, you know, natural endowments of things or other factors. But, you know, there is cooperation. It's just become uncertain, and we don't know what it's going to look like. And so life is going on. We are not in a state of crisis right at this moment. The question about industrial policy, I'd love to talk about that more, but essentially, you know, you have seen a resurgence of what has looked like traditional industrial policy. So instead of this idea like a level playing field, you know, promoting certain industries through subsidies, supports, this can be done for various reasons. For example, if you believe that climate change is a good motivation, then you can think that there are reasons to promote certain industries to foster their growth. People have referred to that as green protectionism, for example. So I think you are seeing a lot of that, and that was the part of economic security cooperation that, you know, was always in tension, but a lot of countries were doing it. You know, I think that essentially the state is reasserting itself in a lot of ways, and that can be in a more promotional way or a more punitive way, and we have to see how that plays out. But the idea is that that does create a much more complex international environment. Maybe just on that note about your comment about tariffs, briefly, the tariffs are designed for so many different purposes. If you talk to people inside the administration, some people want them for revenue so that they can fund a tax cut in the US. Some people want them for reshoring investment. Other people want them explicitly to weaken the dollar. So I think that the tariffs are sort of this, you know, hammer that's trying to hit a lot of different problems. And maybe I would just conclude on one note that kind of came up in the conversation, which is that, you know, it's so interesting to think about RCEP as a low-quality trade agreement, because right now it looks pretty good, you know, compared to what we're seeing with these, for example, the U.S.-UK non-deal that's not legally binding, has no, you know, actual accountability. So I think that, you know, it makes us rethink, I think, some of these assumptions. And RCEP, as you were saying, it is a recognition of the fact that there are political realities in these countries too, right? So I think that we'll have to think about what these trade deals look like, you know, how people can square it with their domestic interests. And I think it's interesting because all countries now have to take that more seriously. It's not just that some countries can't get their house in order. Actually, nobody can get their house in order. So I'll just stop there.
Oh, thank you so much. So I'll take a couple of points. I'll put the question on whether this era of cooperation is over, and also the ASEAN question. I'm reminded of Rolf Emmers and Sufyan Jusso's comments yesterday about the rise of minilateralism and pressures within ASEAN itself, right? Do we negotiate as a group or do we negotiate separately, right? I think I think this era is really going to be a litmus test, I think, for sort of cohesion in the ASEAN grouping, if you will, because it's completely predictable, I think almost rational to think that, yes, we want individual arrangements. I think that's sort of part of the strategy of the Trump administration as well, right? And it makes a lot of sense, but it will be a litmus test. And I guess here I would make the point that ASEAN does not have to negotiate everything as a group. You can, within ASEAN, negotiate on these issues, like student visas, we can negotiate separately, but on something like tariffs, maybe, right, we can negotiate as a group. Right? So I think these things are not, these strategies are not mutually exclusive. And on that note, cooperating is very much important. And there's a lot of incentive, and I think many recommendations out there in the policy literature about cooperation between middle powers, right? Middle powers, not with great powers, but among middle powers, intensifying, right, exchanges as well as cooperation between the middle powers. Who is a middle power? Even Kiribati could be a middle power. I thought even Kiribati, but anybody. So it's almost like a self-definition. But so there you have it. The very important question, is there a substitute? Is there a substitute? There is no substitute, clearly. There is no substitute for the US market. Is there a substitute for the production, sort of sourcing of production in China? So before the start of the first trade war with China, we knew that the wages in China were increasing, right? So already Chinese investment was getting diverted to Southeast Asia. So Vietnam was a major beneficiary. The trade war accelerated this investment into Vietnam. Right. Also, Vietnam can export to the United States without it, sort of avoiding the tariffs, the U.S.-China tariffs, if you will. So one of the the consequences has been that Vietnam has the fourth largest trade deficit with the United States, so he got hit big, right? So with tariffs as well. So it's a different way of saying, in terms of production, so Southeast Asia has been a huge beneficiary, right, of the rising of the trade war, as well as the rising sort of cost of production in China. You can see that as well. I do have also one more comment on the RCEP to make as well. So yes, there seems to be a widely held view that compared to the CPTPP, it's a sort of a shallow agreement. But there is one provision which is really important in this day and time, and that is the rules of origin, provision. Right? The rules of origin provision is a consolidation of 28 different kinds of trade agreements, provisions in trade agreements. It allows for basically much of production to take place across the 15 member countries. So this is ASEAN plus 5 of its partners. So within this region, right, you can have a great deal of advantage and preferential treatment when it comes to producing your goods. And so I guess, so rejiggling or restructuring or organizing your production lines along this sort of the 15 member states will be enormously beneficial to its members. And I think that's a really key benefit of the RCEP, right? Irrespective of the shallowness, if you will, of the whatever other provisions that there are.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Doug.
Okay, so going back to, is there a role for cooperating? Actually, I wanted to respond to your point first. I think, come on, Rogowski. But anyway, I think, we know that it's not just factor endowments. That's sort of point of looking at the persistence of current account surpluses and deficits. It has nothing, if you group the countries just by their factor endowments, it looks very different. It's not just countries with a lot of labor that are trade surplus countries.
That's self-reinforcing.
No, to your other point, I guess I didn't emphasize it enough, and I wanted to make it on my final point that I didn't get to, and that you asked about. For all of these countries, there's clearly internal interest groups that are hurt and helped. So yeah, labor, as I already alluded to, is kind of hurt in these persistent deficit countries, particularly already wealthy ones, but actually it's not. Are the laborers of China doing well under this system of persistent trade surpluses? No. I guess more of them are employed, But if you look at their mechanism to do this, part of the way they jack up savings is to crush consumption, and part of the way they do that, there's no unions. Wages are rising, but arguably lagging far behind productivity. So, we see this in all sorts of aspects. The overall inequality of probably, 50 on a Gini index in China, not a good place to be a laborer. And even with their factor endowments, they could do it. They won't, but we could imagine a better world where they suddenly allow free unions and these other things, and you gradually have a shift towards consumption, which would also lead to a shift to, they'd be importing more, and, some of their relatively low-end exports relying on low wages would disappear from the economy. It would be more balanced, but it would also be more equal to the people in the country. It's definitely true that current account deficits are great for Wall Street and the city in the UK, who happen to be very powerful interest groups in both countries. So that may answer part of the persistence in these places. I think there could be a role for cooperation to end some of this, but there are these differences in how these different, some countries are so wedded to their model of the surplus that it might be hard to bring them into the fold on this. And just as an aside on the issue of blocks, there's been a lot of talk recently that, okay, we're just going to build a world order, a world trading system without the US, or maybe an East Asian trading system. Well, that in particular won't work unless they radically change their growth models that are based on these current account surpluses, because what is going to balance that? So it's quite unlikely. And on Ben's point of, well, wasn't this great? We really need China's production capacity. I mean, in the short term, in specific areas, that is true. If we decide we, for some reason, don't want to import Mattel dolls for Barbie dolls from China, then you're going to have a problem. But even in the, actually relatively short term, we know from looking at the data that there's just more and more excess industrial capacity, even outside of China, that's underutilized. So I would not say that across the board. Obviously, if it went to zero, that would be bad. But here we're talking, relatively in percentage terms, modest adjustment of how much is China-based versus the rest of the world.
Great. Well, thank you. So let me touch upon two issues. And the first issue relates to Boo's point regarding fragmentation, and also Meredith's point regarding spaghetti bowl or noodle bowls. Basically, they are the same thing. Asian-like noodles, we call it noodle bowl syndrome, but they are the same. So we have large FTA, commonly known as mega FTA, in the Asia-Pacific, RCEP, and CPTPP. So within those mega FTAs, there are many trilateral FTA and bilateral FTA, and all these FTA have different rules. Okay, so a lot of people would think that the easiest approach is to terminate all these bilateral or trilateral agreement. This is called clean slate approach. No one is doing that. So most countries are following so-called coexistence approach, meaning that they are all out there. Okay, so that's why we have the fragmentation problem. One important issue that many enterprises are facing, as Suyong mentioned, is rules of origin. For example, if I have this pen here and I want to sell it from Singapore to Japan, guess how many agreements I can use? I can use Singapore-Japan FTA, I can use ASEAN-Japan FTA, I can use RCEP, I can use CPTPP. For SME, how do you figure out which one is better? It's almost impossible, right? That's why the utilization of FTA is actually very, very low. So FTAs can be a very serious issue. So what I'm trying to argue here is that we cannot deal with this issue in a legal way. But what we can do is to have FTA with better rules, so that countries or enterprises will prefer to use this deal. So we can deal with the fragmentation problem on a de facto basis. The second issue relates to the relationship between the EU and the CPTPP that you mentioned. I think it will benefit CPTPP if EU is considering becoming a member. Although people say CPTPP has high-level provision, but actually many provisions nowadays are already outdated. EU's recent agreements with Singapore, Vietnam, and New Zealand have much higher level agreement. So it's not so much a problem. The only problem for EU probably relates to agriculture, right? But you can deal with it by using carve-out exceptions. But institutionally, there's one problem for EU, and that's what we encountered when we negotiated the EU-Singapore agreements. There was a very important European Court decision saying that, oh, you have this agreement. All the trade issues are within the scope of EU competence. But investment issues are outside the EU competence. Okay, so what does it actually mean? It means that trade agreement, pure trade issues, you only need to be, and the agreement only need to be ratified by European Parliament, then it's done deal, become effective. But for investment issues, you actually need to go through not just European Parliament, but also national parliament of all EU member states. So what EU-Singapore decided to do is to come up with two different agreements from the same agreements. One dealing with trade, which is called FTA. The other dealing with investment called IPA, Investment Protection Agreement, right? Okay, as you can imagine, FTA, done deal now. But IPA, I think is traveling around national parliaments, and it will take forever. So that is an institutional issue that the EU needs to deal with when it considers joining the CPTPP.
Great, thank you. I'll just speak very briefly to two of the questions as well that kind of came a little bit to me, and especially because Doug has chided me for bringing up Rogowski being so old. In 1964, there was a really famous article published, and the exact name of the author is escaping me at the moment, but I think it's Akamatsu, a Japanese economist who argued that other economies of East and Southeast Asia would follow Japan's model like a flock of flying geese. 30 years later, when we get to about 1992-93, Mitchell Bernard and John Ravenhill criticized this quite sharply and said, well, actually, we've got different models that are coming. And then building on that, in 1997-98, in reaction to the Asian financial crisis, there's a little-known book chapter by Eichengreen and Fischlow that actually kind of tries to unpack these different kinds of capital flows. And what we're left with understanding then is that rather than this progression of similar developmental states following one after the other across time and sort of gradually moving up the product cycle in a similar way. Instead, what we see are different kinds of capital flowing to different kinds of economies, different kinds of political arrangements, giving rise to different political economies of development. And we can identify a number of different models for this with different sorts of portfolio borrowing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The upshot of this for labor is that as capital is increasingly mobile and increasingly rapidly mobile in more creative ways, it makes it much harder either to slow this process of transition away from certain sectors and into others, or in most cases, to do anything to ameliorate or salve the social dislocation resulting from the displacement of existing labor. And so even in China then, if we go back to China of the 1990s, early 2000s, we see the displacement of a huge group of labor, or a huge segment of the labor force in state enterprises, at the same moment that we see the boom of manufacturing really take off. But it's different labor pools, right? The 19-year-old or 20-year-old from the countryside working in the export processing manufacturing plant in Dongguan is not taking the same job that's being lost by the 50-year-old laid-off worker in Tieling in Liaoning province, for example, right? It's not the same. And so therefore we can see different segments of large national economies growing differently, which then brings up the other point to Scott's question on China's domestic political economy and the challenges there. One thing I've thought for a long time, but haven't written up, and a lot of other people could have written, but I think have not, is that if we look at things like the variety of capitalism literature, right, David Soskis and others who make these arguments about sort of coordinated versus liberal market economies, essentially what they're saying is that market economies can be differentiated by the way in which labor is priced and allocated. Right? We're talking really about the ways in which they assign labor to different sectors and the way that labor is priced and remunerated. I would argue, in contrast to that, that socialist and post-socialist economies, of which China would be one, actually don't fight over the allocation and pricing of labor in terms of their domestic politics, but rather the allocation and pricing of capital. Right? It's the way in which capital is apportioned to different parts of the economy. And so what we've seen in China is a tremendous boom of capital flowing into certain sectors and regions and industries where it has not brought a great return to GDP or to the owners of that capital, would be one way to put it. And so a clear manifestation of this is the real estate bubble that has been sort of under deflation since 2015 at least, but also we see bubbles in other kinds of asset prices like equities that are well underway. I think that those are the fundamental underlying issues in China's political economy. And until those are addressed, as well as an over-reliance on aggregate investment rather than consumption, which is actually something the Chinese government recognizes and is trying to fix, but without much results, what that will mean is that we'll see more overcapacity, more sort of winding down of bubbles, and less vibrance of consumption and GDP growth over the medium term at least, with all kinds of other externalities resulting from that. So I think that's what I'd say about those two questions. If there are more questions, we can take a very quick second round and then give our panelists a chance to respond. If there's a couple of burning ones. Let's take the two from the back. So over to the left and then the right.
Thank you very much. I have one question for all the panelists, perhaps, about changing consumer patterns. We've talked about trade deficits, financial markets, and so on. So these are existing institutions, and we're talking about changing those or how we change or reform those. But I'm also sort of doing some work on sort of ESG stuff and sustainability, and one of the key things seems to be changing consumer behavior. So that would also have sort of social, cultural implications. So I was wondering what your outlook, it's not so much prescription, but your outlook might be on what would be the potential or possibility of, while we change these structures and systems, would the changing sort of social values, value creation might also change as well. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And one last question.
Thank you very much. I believe that occasionally we can observe misalignment between the emergence of new economic security regimes and growing projection of economic statecraft. And I wonder how, in your opinion, we could bridge this gap or reconcile these two concepts. So what I specifically have in mind is that many economic security policies are seeking to protect goods that are perceived to have a strategic value, and they are often higher up value chains. So, for example, dual-use technologies, ICT, and so on. But then in deployment of economic statecraft by players such as China, we often see that goods that are lower on the value chain are targeted. So we have seen this with China targeting agricultural imports from countries that didn't behave politically as China intended, with Taiwanese pineapples or Lithuanian grain or Norwegian salmon. So as we try to avoid economic nationalism and bolster these new collective regimes of economic security? How can we identify spaces to also incorporate these goods that are lower down the value chains, perhaps not as economically salient, but very politically salient, as farmers are politically salient in these new regimes? Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much both for excellent questions. Let's give the panelists 30 seconds each to respond, really, because we're very soon to go to the coffee break. Let's go in the reverse order in which they spoke. So Pasha, Doug, Suyona, and Christy.
Okay, so let me be very brief regarding Martin's questions. So it's true. I mean, now I think most countries will actually to incorporate the concept of economic security into trade agreements. When I say trade agreements, I'm not referring to FTAs, because FTAs are too slow. So the new trend is to conclude sectoral agreements or new style agreement, like what Christy mentioned, the US-UK agreement. The agreement is called Economic Prosperity Agreement. It's not an FTA, right? And the national security and diversification, of course, key components of these new style agreements. Yeah.
On the issue of ESG, I guess potentially that could lead to changing values. I guess I'm mainly concerned if we look how it's applied across different countries. Sometimes with existing institutions, it's just sort of heavily mediated through them, so it does become like greenwashing and these other problems. So for it to be, be more impactful, I guess you would have to see new institutional arrangements for it.
Thank you. Can I just pass so that we don't we don't hold up the line for the coffee?
You can
just continue our conversation.
You can take 30 seconds, but you can also.
Yes, I'll pass.
Christy.
Briefly, on changing consumer patterns, that's a very deep question. Right now, our system is not structured that way at all, and it's about basically really excessive consumerism in some places driving certain patterns of growth. If people were really to change that, I think it would have an impact. It would be a very different model that would be more centered on different patterns of consumption from certain places, and I think the standard of living that one could achieve might be moderated. So I think it would require a lot of change and different priorities, and it's important those discussions are going on, but I think it would look different from what we have now. And then on the question about economic security and economic statecraft, again, this is a very good and complicated question, but I would just say that with different kinds of goods, if I go back to what I was talking about, for more consumer goods, I think a lot of that discussion is about resilience and reducing risk from disruption, and a lot of times the goal is diversification or having more sources. And then with, you were saying, the higher tech goods, that's where we see more of what I was calling this focus on competitiveness, where you're promoting basically revitalization of your own domestic capacity, or you are doing things that are more on the punitive protection side about export controls and restricting technology from getting out. So I think that the menu of economic statecraft and using economic tools proactively, and I think economic security often tends to be on the more defensive end. They're all interrelated. It's a very complicated, basically good by good, sector by sector kind of assessment, and that's why these definitions are quite important, because they result in very different policies.
Great, thank you very much. And with that, I thank the panelists and the audience both for your attention and wonderful participation on this very warm and sunny morning.